those of you that trained in the 80s or 90s or were practicing emergency medicine in the 80s or 90s, particularly in the inner city, know that they were decades of incredible violence, and they still are in lots of cities. I was in LA as a resident during that time, and it was not uncommon for us to do 6 thoracotomies a night. There was just so much violence. And many of us were thinking, what the hell is going on here? The inner city is in a war. But there are other people outside the emergency department who are also doing a lot of work as well. They saw the dead bodies flowing down the river, as it were, and said, we should go upstream and see what's going on. We have one of those people here today. The amount of violence, interpersonal violence in Los Angeles between gang members has plummeted in the last 20 to 30 years. And it's because of a number of different forces, but the single most important force is Father Greg Boyle. Father Boyle, can you come and join us? His work with Homeboy is legendary. We're very proud to be associated with Father Boyle at our residency and with this conference. They just are doing remarkable work, and I just thank you for coming to just tell us a little bit about what you've been doing.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. I presume I stand in the carpet here.
Yes.
Oh,
you'll
gosh. I had no idea I was bald. Thank you for pointing that out. I apologize if some of you have heard me before. It happens. I give a lot of talks, and for 15 years or so at Keck School in Los Angeles, myself and a bunch of homies always give some training of some kind about gangs and ER. And it happens that people maybe have wandered into a talk I've given before. I always feel badly about that. Once I spoke at a foster grandparent gathering, a huge gathering in Southern California. Well, I had spoken at the same event the summer before. I don't know why they invited me 2 summers in a row, but there you have it. And so afterwards, after the second one, this grandmother came up to me and she had big tears in her eyes, and she said, I think she liked the talk, and she grabbed both my hands and she said, I heard you last year. It never gets better. So kind of hoping she misspoke there, but I can't believe you're up this early. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, folks on the margins are always hoping for some notice. I had a 16-year-old gang member, very earnest, standing in front of my desk. He said, "Look, I need your divided attention." I said, "You are in luck, because that's exactly what you'll be getting." I was thinking this morning that what Martin Luther King said of church could well be said of your days here together at this conference. It's not the place you've come to, it will always be the place you go from. And all of you are kind of armed and equipped with a kind of vision. I can only do aerial view. You're going to get into the weeds about what your job means. But I think the aerial view is always kind of enhanced by a vision that kind of undergirds it, a vision of wanting the world to look differently than it currently looks. The prophet Habakkuk writes, "The vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, wait for it." But my sense of you already is that you don't want to wait for too long, con los brazos cruzados, tapping your feet and staring at your watches, You want to make something happen, like within 3 minutes. You want to, I think, create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. I think Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? How do we imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? How do we together, in our own particularity, seek to dismantle the barriers that exclude? And I think we do that in a way by inching our way out to the margins, out to the edges. The trick about margins is that if you stand at them, look under your feet. They are somehow getting erased because you've chosen to stand there. And so you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. You stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. You stand with those whose dignity has been denied. All of you encounter in the ER folks who are easily despised and readily left out. You stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. And with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. I suspect that if kinship was our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice. We'd be celebrating it. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no peace. So for 30 years in Los Angeles, I've worked with gang members, and it's been just the privilege of my life to do that. And honest to God, they've taught me everything of value. But in the last couple of years, they've taught me how to text, and I'm so grateful to them. I find that it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people. And I'm pretty good at it, you know, LOL and OMG and BTW. And the homies have taught me a new one, OHN, which apparently stands for, oh, hell no. And I've been using that one quite a bit lately. And so there I am in a car with two older vatos, Manuel and Poncho. Older guys, tattooed, been to prison, who do a variety of things for me at Homeboy. We have 400 employees there. We gather for the morning meeting at 10 minutes to 9. And at 9, they got in a car with me. They're going to help me give a talk at a high school in Palm Springs. And so Manuel's in the front seat, and he, within 15 minutes, he gets kind of an incoming text. And so he kind of reads it to himself, and he chuckles. And I go, well, what is it? Oh, it's dumb. It's from Snoopy back at the office. Well, I'd just seen Snoopy. Snoopy and Manuel work together in the clock-in room where they clock in hundreds and hundreds of our workers, and it's a tough job, actually. And I said, well, what's he say? Hang on a second, it's dumb. Hey, dog, it's me, Snoops. Yeah, they got my ass locked up at county jail. They're charging me with being the ugliest vato in America. You have to come down right now, show them they got the wrong guy. Well, we died laughing, and I nearly drove into oncoming traffic. And then I realized that Manuel and Snoopy are enemies. They're from rival gangs. They used to shoot bullets at each other. Now they shoot text messages. And there's a word for that, and the word is kinship. How do we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate, that there's an us and a them? How do we even bridge the distance that exists even in your service? I thought that was fascinating. The day I stop crying is the day I quit. I think there's a huge wisdom in that. Because even in service providing, there's a distance, you know, service provider, service recipient. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. Truth be told, we're all in need of healing. We're all a cry for help. It's one of the things that joins us together as human beings. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend, and he was, quite apart from all his historical significance, he was an extraordinary listener. He would always receive you. And if you were talking to him, nobody else existed. Extraordinary. And I remember once a reporter had commented to him and said, wow, these farm workers, they sure love you. And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, the feeling's mutual. And that's what you hope for. How do we arrive at this mutuality where we bridge the distance even in service? You know, service is the hallway. But you don't want to stop there. It gets you to the ballroom, and that's where you want to end up, which is the place of kinship. No homie found more job opportunities through Homeboy Industries than this guy, Caesar. Everybody called him Dreamer. I knew him since he was a little mocosito growing up in the projects, and a very smart kid, but though he never really went to school, but had a dangerous sense of humor. But there was a period in his life, his early 20s, when he was kind of a yo-yo. I'd find him a job, and then he'd gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd kind of get popped again and be in jail, and then he'd wander back to me. So this one time he had finished a 4-month stretch of probation violation at LA County Jail, and there he is sitting in front of me in my office, and he says what gang members often say, "This time it'll be different." And I go, all right. So with him sitting there, I call a friend of mine who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California, and this guy had hired homies in the past, so I'm hoping he might do it again. And so he does. He says, "Tell Caesar he starts tomorrow." And so Caesar begins work at this vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again, sitting in front of my desk. I go, "Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go." But this time he pulls out of his pocket his very first paycheck, and he waves it proudly, and he says, "Damn, G, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job." And I said, "Well, who?" And he looked at me strangely, and he said, "Well, God, of course." "Oh, sure, no, that's right." No, that would be God, of course, yeah. He said, "You thought I was going to say you." I said, "No, gosh, God is number one, yeah." He said, "You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days." I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, "Yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now," he said, Well, all I remember is we just dissolved in laughter, and suddenly kinship so quickly, it's mutual. Homeboy Industries was born during the time I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, Dolores Mission, nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. At the time, they were the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, making it, according to LAPD, the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in the world was my parish. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and I buried my 183rd a month ago. So we did a lot of things in those early days. First thing we did was we started a school because there were so many junior high age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them, so they were wreaking havoc in the projects and violent and writing on walls. So I walked out to them and I said, "Hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And then to my surprise, each one said, "Yeah." And then I couldn't find a school that would take them. So that kind of forced my hand. So I went to the convent, which was at the time situated on the 3rd floor of our parochial elementary school, first 2 floors school. Whole 3rd floor was the convent. And I gathered the nuns together in the living room, and I said, "Hey, would you guys mind, moving out? And we could start a school for gang members." And so that's what we did. And so gang members came in large numbers to the church, which kind of upset the apple cart, because aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed, good people in and bad people out, and that was a good challenge. And then the gang members said, if only we had jobs. And so myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the projects that surrounded the housing, the factories surrounding the housing projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers. And that wasn't so forthcoming. So we hired homies to do a lot of things, build a child care center and paint out graffiti, but it wasn't enough. So I went finally to a movie producer who I asked him to buy this old dilapidated abandoned bakery across the street from the church, and I said, "Well, we'll call it Homeboy Bakery, and enemies will bake bread together," and he liked the idea. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market in downtown LA. Once we had plural, we came up with the highfalutin Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this venture. Not everything worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And nobody ever plans to do something like this, but we backed our way and evolved our way into becoming the largest gang intervention, rehab, and reentry program in the world. 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors There are 1,100 gangs in LA County, 120,000 gang members. Of course, a lot of them are incarcerated. And so you name anything that might be helpful. We all sorts of curricular things for our 250 trainees who are there for 18 months. Anger management, parenting, you name it. Free tattoo removal. No place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos than we do. We have a designated clinic with 3 laser machines, 1 paid physician assistant. I don't know what our number is. Dr. Perlman here is the great Dr. Perlman who volunteers there. I think we got 30 plus doctors who volunteer their time, something like 46,000 laser treatments a year. And it all started because of a guy named Frank who wandered into my office 2 days out of Corcoran State Prison. And he's sitting in front of my desk, and I'd never met him before, and tattooed on his forehead, filling the entire space like a friggin' billboard, was "fuck the world." And he said, "You know, I am having a hard time finding a job." And I said, well, Frank, maybe we could put our heads together on this one, and so I think, where do I send him? McDonald's, do you want fries with that? No, we don't want fries. And so I hired him at the bakery. He worked for 2 years bagging bread, and then I went and found a doc at White Memorial Hospital who gave me 1 hour a month to chip away at Frank's forehead and a few others. And before no time at all, I had a waiting list of 3,000 gang members who wanted this service. So we couldn't kind of remain in the same plan. Parentheses, Frank is a security guard at a movie studio, and there is no trace left of the dumbest, angriest thing he had ever done in his life. Proving that all of us are a whole lot more than the worst things we've ever done. And so we have all our other programs. We have our training programs, solar panel installation training program. We have, we're in 40 or so farmers markets. We have 3 organic mini farms that provide produce for our restaurants. Homeboy Diner, the only place you can get food at City Hall. We have a restaurant at the LAX American Airlines terminal. Homeboy Silkscreen, Homeboy Bakery is thriving. Homeboy Homegirl Merchandise, where we sell our logo stuff online and in our store. Chips and salsas we sell in all the Ralphs from Santa Barbara to San Diego. I don't know what I'm missing. I know I'm missing something. Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. Some years ago, Oscar-winning actress Diane Keaton showed up for lunch, and she of Annie Hall, Academy Award, and Godfather movies, big movie star. She shows up with a regular, a guy who's there once a week for lunch, and her waitress this day is Glenda. And Glenda's a big girl, big, huge girl, been to prison, tattooed, gang member, felon, parolee. She doesn't know who Diane Keaton is, and so she's taking her order, and Diane Keaton says, "Well, what do you recommend?" And Glenda rattles off the 3 platillos that she particularly likes, and Diane Keaton says, "Oh, I'll have that second one. That one sounds good." And it's at that moment that something dawns on Glenda. She looks at Diane Keaton, she says, "Wait a minute. I feel like I know you. Like maybe we've met." And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly. "Oh, gosh, I don't know. I suppose I have one of those faces, that people think they've seen before." And then Glenda goes, "No, now I know. We were locked up together." Honest to God, that just took my breath away when I heard it. And I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind. And if you'll permit me, I'm a Jesuit priest and it's Sunday morning, at least where I come from in a faith world, we find out what's on God's mind, I think, when Jesus says to the gathered, "that you may be one." It's about us. It's about obliterating once and for all the illusion that we are separate. There's an idea that's taken root in the world. It's at the root of all that's wrong with it, and the idea would be this, that there just might be lives out there that matter less than other lives. How do we stand against that idea? How do we inch our way out to the edges, to the margins, in the hope that they'll be erased? And we brace ourselves because people will accuse us of wasting our time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And that's what you do for a living. You make those voices heard. This conference is not the place you've come to. It will always be the place you go from. All of us are called to be what Alice Miller, the late great child psychologist, called enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. You don't hold the bar up and ask anybody to measure up. You just show up and you hold the mirror up and you tell people the truth, knowing that your truth is my truth and my truth is a gang member's truth, and it all happens to be the same truth, and here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks, especially those on the margins, as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it, no 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it because it's huge. But all of you know the need sometimes to reach in and to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. The great scripture scholar Marcus Borg says that the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout Scripture is shame and disgrace, and I think that's quite right. Lately, I've been taking a leisurely stroll through the Acts of the Apostles, and I suppose you could read it as a quaint snapshot of life in the earliest Christian community, or you could read it as the measure of health in any community at all. Things leap off the page for you. See how they love one another. That's a good measurement. There's nobody needy in this community, a great metric. But my favorite one was this. And awe came upon everyone. It would seem that the measure of health in any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. Some years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and it was a in-service on gangs from 9 to 3. I was the only invited person, so I invited 2 homies with me to help me share the burden of it. And Andre, African-American gang member, and Jose, a Latino gang member. I encouraged them to tell their stories and take their time. And Jose, I'd never heard Jose's story, and he was in his late 20s, gang member, been to prison, tattooed, worked his way up in our organization from janitorial crew to a valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solidly in his recovery himself. And now he was helping younger homies deal with their addiction. A man who was in prison, gang member, but also had a long stretch, a time as a homeless person, and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he got up to tell his story, and he began in sort of an offhanded way. You know, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me." Well, 600 social workers gasp. And he says, "It sounds way worser in Spanish," he says. And everybody laughed. He said, "I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she says, 'I found this kid.' And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me. My grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through, and the second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stops speaking and becomes so overwhelmed with emotion, and he just seems to be staring at a piece of his story that only he can see. And when he can speak through his tears, he says, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. And now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. And the measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. One last story. People always ask me about enemies working together, and it is dicey at first, I suppose. A homie will come in and say, I'm ready. And I'll say, okay, I have an opening in the bakery, but you got to work with X, Y, and Z. And I rattle off the names of rivals, enemies. And they always do the same thing. They think for a long-ass time, and then they say, okay, I'll work with them, but I'm not going to talk to them. Which used to bother me in the early days, but until you discover, of course, that it's impossible for people to demonize people they know. Human beings can't sustain that. So I had a little guy, everybody called him Youngster. It was his gang name. Some gang names, if they're benign, I'll Youngster, Lefty, Flaco. I won't do the Psycho or Sniper. I don't do those, I had a big homie come in my office the other day right out of prison. I said, what do your homies call you? Fluffy. I am trembling in my boots, So I had this kid, Youngster, little chaparrito, and he was, I thought he was ready, so I bring him to our Homeboy silkscreen, which is our biggest business, been around for the longest, and thousands and thousands of gang members have worked there over the years. And so we have a huge factory kind of off campus, and so I'm introducing him to his 30 coworkers, and I watch Youngster shake hands with each one, look them straight in the eye, even enemies, and there were a lot of rivals there when he showed up, and I thought, wow, this is great. Until he gets to the last guy, a guy everybody calls Puppet, and Puppet seems to be wanting to avoid this encounter altogether. And so when the two of them are in each other's vicinity, they mumble something, they stare at their shoes, they don't shake hands. Well, I know that they're enemies because I know what gangs they're from, but he just finished shaking hands with other rivals, and so I found out later that this is a hatred that was really quite deep and quite personal and beyond which neither of them think they can really get past. So I sensed that much at the moment, and I said, look, if you guys can't hang working together, let me know. I got a bunch of people who want this job. Calladitos, they don't say a word. Well, 6 months later, a Puppet is walking from his home to a store some distance from his house, and it's a little corner store, and he buys something. But on his way home, for some reason, he decides to take a shortcut, so he dodges into an alley. And because he's taken this detour, suddenly, unexpectedly, he's surrounded by 10 members of a rival gang, 10 against 1, and they beat him badly. And he falls to the ground, and while he's lying there, they will not stop kicking his head until he's lifeless. Somebody finds his body and takes him to White Memorial Hospital, where he's declared effectively brain dead, but they keep him connected to machines for 48 hours so they can get 2 days of a flat read with no brain activity. You know this better than me. This allowed family and friends to gather, and I was at St. Louis University giving a talk. I flew home immediately. I've seen a lot of horrible things in my life, but nothing to compare to the sight of this young man with his head swollen many times its size. It was just horrifying. You could barely train your eyes on him. So at the end of the 48-hour period, I gave him a blessing. I anointed his forehead with oil. We disconnected, and a week later I buried him. But in the first 24 hours as he was lying beaten in the hospital, I'm alone in my office. It's 8:30 at night, and the phone rings, and it's youngster, Puppet's coworker from the silk screen, and he says, "Hey, that's messed up about what happened to Puppet." I said, "Yeah, it is." And then with a certain kind of eagerness even, he says, "Is there anything I can do? Can I give him my blood?" And we both fall silent under the weight of it, until finally he breaks the silence, choking back his tears, and he says with great deliberation, "He was not my enemy. He was my friend. We worked together." Now, can I say that always happens at Homeboy Industries? Yes, of course. Any exceptions? Not a single one. And it shouldn't surprise us that God's own dream come true for us, that we be one, just happens to be our own deepest longing for ourselves. For it turns out it's mutual. This conference is not the place you've come to. It will always be the place you go from, to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. For the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, we wait for it. Thank you all very much.